People often ask, what is God's plan for my life? But when's the last time you considered the question, what is God's plan for my family? What is God's plan for my family? Now, I suspect that in our culture, we have such an overemphasis on the individual that we sometimes miss what God is doing in the family and in the group. But what we see in Scripture is that God certainly does work in the lives of individuals, but He also works in the lives of the collective, in the lives of the community, of the family. And I think we can see God working in the lives of families in the Bible. God's plan for Abraham, for Isaac, and Jacob was to work through them, giving them a family that would become a great nation. And that nation would be the people through whom God would eventually bring the Messiah. I mean, that's what we're celebrating at Christmas. The Messiah has come. Well, that was done through the family of Israel. God had a plan for them. Now, He had a plan for Abraham as an individual, for Isaac as an individual, for Jacob as an individual, but He also had a plan for them as a family, collectively. So what is God's plan for your family? What role are you to play in that plan? God's plan for your family. Now, maybe you've never paused to ask those questions or to think about it in those terms. I think we're kind of programmed to think about everything individualistically. But today we're going to see in the life of Joseph and his father Jacob that not only did God have a plan for their family, but He also seems to have revealed some of that to them through Jacob and even through Abraham, as we've seen. But Jacob seems to speak into their lives. He speaks some God-given wisdom. Hopefully by the time you're 147 years old, you've accumulated some God-given wisdom. Okay, that's what we see in Jacob. And so he speaks into their lives and he blesses them. But I think maybe he helps them see their role in God's future plan. And so we're going to pick up where we left off last week in the life of Joseph, and we'll pick up in Genesis chapter 48. Sometime after this, Joseph was told, "Your father is weaker." So he set out with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and He blessed me. He said to me, 'I will make you fruitful and numerous. I will make many nations come from you, and I will give you this land as a permanent possession to your future descendants. Your two sons born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh belong to me, just as Reuben and Simeon do. Children born to you after them will be yours, and will be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to their inheritance. When I was returning from Padan Aram, to my sorrow, Rachel died along the way, some distance from Ephrath in the land of Canaan, and I buried her there along the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem." And so here in this passage, we see Jacob nearing the end of his life. I mean, he's 147 years old. It's, time to go, okay? I mean, he's nearing the end of his life. And we see him preparing to give each of his sons his final blessing, say his last words to them. And Joseph is called down to see his father, probably for the last time, and he knows this, so he brings his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Jacob specifically is going to bless Joseph. While Reuben is actually the oldest son, Joseph is the firstborn of his favorite wife, Rachel. And Reuben got somewhat demoted because of his bad behavior. We'll look at that in just a moment. But what we see here is that, in a manner of speaking, Joseph is going to get Jacob's blessing as the oldest son. Now, in the ancient world, the oldest son would get a double portion of the blessing, but the oldest would also have the responsibility of caring for their parents. And this is what we see kind of a theme running throughout the Bible. The oldest had that responsibility. And I guess since Joseph is the one providing for his whole family, I mean, they're all down there in Egypt. He's providing the food. He's providing their safety and security. I mean, he is fulfilling that duty to take care of his father and fulfilling that responsibility. So what they would do is they would divide the inheritance into one more equal part than the number of children they had. And the oldest would get 2 shares. Okay? Think of it as stock. Okay? You can have so many shares of stock. The oldest would get 2 shares. For example, if you had 2 children, you would divide the inheritance in 3 parts. The oldest would get 2 shares. The youngest would get 1 share. If you had 12 children, you would divide the inheritance 13 ways. The oldest would get 2 shares and the others would get 1. Does that make sense? I mean, you're following. This is how they would deal with the division of the inheritance to the oldest child, but also they would have the responsibility of caring for the parents. And so Joseph is the son who's going to get 2 shares of Jacob's inheritance, and they will be divided between his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. These 2 become equal tribes to Joseph's brothers. Jacob tells Joseph that these 2 sons that Joseph had in Egypt will now be counted as his. He's kind of adopting them. They are going to be counted as his, and they're going to get the 2 shares of the oldest. But if you have any other kids, then they'll just get the inheritance underneath Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, this is actually something you want to pick up on as you're studying in the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, Israel has 12 tribes, and you keep running into all 13 of them. Okay, anybody run into this in the Old Testament? I mean, this is a frequent thing that you see in the Old Testament. And the reason for that is Manasseh and Ephraim are technically half tribes. Okay, the 2 of them make up the tribe of Joseph. But they are counted as 2 separate tribes. He gets the double blessing of the oldest, 2 tribes, 2 shares. And so when you see the list of the tribes, you'll often see 13. So there's 13 out of 12. Okay. And this is why we get this whole dynamic. And if you miss that all the way through the Old Testament, you're going to be scratching your head, okay? Because the math gets a little fuzzy if you miss this passage. So Israel has these 12 sons. They make up the 13 tribes of Israel, or you might say 11 tribes and 2 half-tribes, which is Joseph and his descendants. Jacob also discusses with Joseph at this time, he discusses the lament that the 2 of them share. And that is the death of Rachel. He recounts where she was buried there by Bethlehem. Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, as you'll recall. She's the one that, he worked for 7 years to get, and then his father-in-law tricked him and gave him the wrong one, and then so he had to work another 7 years to get her. But that's Joseph's mother. And so the 2 of them share this bond. Rachel is Jacob's favorite wife, but it's also Joseph's mother, and they share the lament. She's already passed on. She's already gone. And so there's kind of this moment where they are having this lament as they say goodbye to Jacob. But Jacob's focus, even though Joseph has come to say goodbye and is lamenting the loss of his father, I'm sure, Jacob really is focused on blessing his descendants. And that's what we're going to see through the rest of this passage. And I think maybe this is something we miss. Many people, when they are dying, focus on their own departure. We tend to turn internal. I'm focusing on the things I missed, or the things I wanted to do, or the things that I did do. But Jacob, as we saw last week, he's already made the arrangements for his burial, and so he's focused primarily not just on his dying, but on his family living. We get almost 2 full chapters of him blessing his descendants as he's preparing to die. Not him lamenting the stuff he didn't get to do, him blessing his descendants. And maybe this is because he's 147 years old. I think, we can learn something from Jacob. Maybe after 147 years, you're just ready to go. I've had enough, okay? But maybe we need to learn from Jacob and be not so self-absorbed with our own death that we can't see God's working in our family. Because they will go on even when we don't. Guys, none of us are eternal, right? How many of your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents are going to be here for Christmas? Why? Because they're gone, okay? I mean, life goes on. And we need to think in those terms of our descendants and think in terms of eternity. Guys, we get to go on to heaven. But our descendants will continue on in this earth, and let's hope that they hear about Christ. Let's make arrangements so that they hear about Christ. Now, rather than being surprised that life goes on without us or be absorbed in our own departure, maybe we should be looking for that opportunity to speak godly wisdom into their lives so it can be a lasting blessing. And I think that's really what Jacob's doing here. He's trying to speak what he sees, some godly wisdom, the things he sees in the family. He wants to speak it into their lives. And so let's pick up again in verse 8 of chapter 48, and we're going to see Jacob's blessing of Manasseh and Ephraim. It said, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons. God has given me here." So Israel said, "Bring them to me, and I will bless them." Now his eyesight was poor because of old age. He could hardly see. Joseph brought them to him, and he kissed and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face again, but now God has even let me see your offspring." Then Joseph took them from his father's knees and bowed with his face to the ground. Then Joseph took them both with his right hand, Ephraim, towards Israel's left, and with his left hand, Manasseh, toward Israel's right, and brought them to Israel. But Israel stretched out his right hand and put it on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and crossing his hands, put his left hand on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. And may they be called by my name, the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow to be numerous within the land." When Joseph saw that his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was a mistake and took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh. Joseph said to his father, "Not that way, my father. This is the firstborn. Put your hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a tribe, and he too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his offspring will become a populous nation." So he blessed them that day, putting Ephraim before Manasseh, when he said, "The nation Israel will invoke blessings by you, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." So Jacob, at this point, he's 147 years old. And without cataract surgery or glasses, he's pretty hard to see. You know, he can't see well. Okay, I mean, at 147, if you don't have any surgery or glasses, you probably won't be seeing too well either. Okay, just to let you know, we do have the blessing of things. But perhaps Jacob is taking a note from his own life. I find it interesting. Joseph brings his sons, and Jacob asks, "Who are these?" Now remember, Jacob's the one who posed as his brother to get the blessing. You know, Jacob's verifying identities before he starts blessing people. I mean, he wants to know, who is this? Who is this that I'm seeing? And he's not seeing so good. But Joseph says, "These are my sons," and so it's okay, and so he goes to bless them. And actually, it's a good moment of God's blessing on Jacob's life. You know, in spite of all the hardships he's gone through, he's been through a rough life. He had his own son, Joseph. He thought he was dead. They found his coat with blood, and Jacob's sure he's been torn apart by wild animals. He probably thought he would never see him again. And yet now, not only is he seeing Joseph, he's seeing his grandsons. It's a great moment in Jacob's life, a moment of God's blessing, seeing him through those trials and tribulations to the moment where God had blessed them all greatly. So Joseph brings his boys to Jacob so he can put his right hand on the oldest and his left hand on the youngest and bless them. The oldest, Manasseh, is supposed to get, according to tradition, the greater blessing. But when Jacob blesses them, he crosses his hands. He puts his right hand on Ephraim. He puts his left hand on Manasseh, Joseph's younger son. So he further changes the order when he gives them a blessing, and he refers to them in the wrong order as Ephraim and Manasseh. Now you'll see this kind of later in the Bible, but see, you're supposed to put the oldest first. He doesn't. He puts Ephraim, the younger son, first, and Manasseh, the older son, second. Now, most of us probably wouldn't care much about this because I suspect in our culture, our words and actions really have little meaning. We really do use words far too lightly. We should guard more what comes out of our mouth. But Joseph, on the other hand, gets kind of upset. No, wait a minute. He thinks Jacob, well, he's kind of a doddering old man at 147. And so he figures Jacob's just confused. He got it wrong. And he's, no, Father, don't do it that way. But see, Jacob knows exactly what he's doing. Jacob knows exactly what he's doing. And he refuses to have his right hand moved to the older son because the younger son is going to be the greater, is what he tells him. Ephraim and Manasseh would become two of the largest tribes, and this does happen in history. In fact, later on, if you put the two together, they get the most land. And during the time of the divided kingdom, Ephraim would become the ruling tribe of the northern kingdom. And so what Jacob is telling them is what does come to pass. Now, the actual Jacob blessing that Jacob gives them is found here in verse 15 and 16. Let's look at that again. It says, then he blessed Joseph, Jacob, he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. He's asking for God's blessing on these boys. He says, and may they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow to be numerous within the land. And so basically what Jacob is doing is the blessing of Abraham, the blessing of Isaac, the blessing of Jacob is getting passed down specifically to the sons of Joseph. These two sons. Jacob asks for the God who has been with him, the God who was his shepherd all the days of his life, the God who sent the guardian angel to bless these boys in the name of Abraham and Isaac. And that name, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would be granted to them and that they would grow numerous. Now, this isn't to say the blessing of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob isn't on all of the other tribes of Israel, because indeed it is. I mean, God promised to bless all of Jacob's descendants. And so when God says, I'm going to bless all your descendants, I'm going to make them tribes, you can bank on what God has to say. But Jacob is specifically wanting this blessing to be on Joseph's sons. He's getting the blessing of the firstborn. He wants them to become a great nation, and Israel will, but so will they. Continuing in verse 21. They continue their conversation. It says, Israel said to Joseph, look, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you back to the land of your fathers. Over and above what I am giving your brothers, I am giving you the one mountain slope that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. Now what's interesting here is Jacob is going to be speaking on the basis of faith in what God promised. God told Abraham that he would give him this land. God told Isaac he would give him this land. God tells Jacob he would give him this land. And so Jacob is now basically giving his will and testament. I'm giving the land to my descendants. How much of that land do they own? See, they're doing this on faith based on what God has promised, with an exception, and that is that this piece of land that Jacob is discussing here is the land he owns by his own labor. He took it with his sword and his bow. And that piece of land that he owns, the piece of land that he conquered, that piece he's giving to Joseph. He says, I want Joseph to have this one piece of land, the piece that I own. Joseph gets the first tangible land of inheritance. By faith, though, Jacob bequeaths all of the promised land to his descendants. And he believes what God said. See, God told Abraham, you know what? Your descendants are going to go into a foreign nation for 400 years until I grow them into a great nation, and then I'll bring them back to the promised land. Jacob is basing everything he says on faith in God's promise. Are you willing to trust your family's future in faith on God's promise? See, he said, God said it's going to be so I'm giving it to you now. Here it is. Even though I don't tangibly see it or have it. That's faith. Now, in the following chapter, Jacob blesses each of his sons. We're going to look at that. Some of what he says clearly reflects what he knew about them as individuals, but other parts were somewhat prophetic and foretell things that were to come in the nation of his descendants. Interestingly enough, he doesn't give them their blessing strictly in birth order. You would think he would. He starts off that way, but he doesn't. He does the sons of Leah, for the most part, his first wife. Then he does the sons of the concubines, and then he finishes with the sons of Rachel, his favorite wife. And so it's not quite in birth order. It's almost in birth order, but not quite as we go through this. And so let's go ahead and pick up Genesis 49, pick up in verse 1, and we're going to see Jacob's blessing on his sons. Then Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather around, and I will tell you what will happen to you in the days to come. Come together and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father, Israel. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, and the firstfruits of my virility. Excelling in promise, excelling in power, turbulent as water, you will not excel, because you got into your father's bed, and you defiled it. He got into my bed." Now Reuben was Jacob's oldest son, his firstborn of Leah. But as you'll remember in the story, Reuben had slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine. Jacob never got over it. That kind of thing will cause trouble in your family, by the way. I mean, okay. Even if your father has 4 wives, he doesn't want you sleeping with any of them. I mean, it's just telling you. But this overshadows Reuben's life forever. In fact, it goes to overshadow the tribe. Even here at Jacob's deathbed, it's what Jacob brings up. It's kind of sad, really, if you think about it. The last words Jacob would speak to his son Reuben and about his son Reuben were reminding him of his sin. Jacob doesn't seem to think much of Reuben or that much will ever come from him. And by the way, Reuben never makes it to the promised land, that tribe. An interesting note, I actually have a map here. Reuben is over here on the other side of the Dead Sea. They're one of the tribes who settle in the wilderness before Israel goes into the promised land. It's interesting that Reuben, who Jacob says, he's never going to amount to much, that's the one of the tribes who settles on the other side in the wilderness. Now, that's because Reuben's tribe was shepherds, and they said, hey, this is good grazing land. We just want to stay here. We don't want to go to the promised land. But they decide to settle east of the Jordan River, and they actually are sandwiched between the nations of Moab and Ammon. And I'm not aware of any major Bible character ever coming from the tribe of Reuben. I mean, they just kind of fade into history once they have their land. How much does your sin affect future generations? Might be a worthy question to ponder. Because I think Reuben's sin seems to have affected his future generations quite a bit. Now, he continues on, Genesis 49, the next brothers in line from Leah. Genesis 49, beginning of verse 5, says, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their knives are vicious weapons. May I never enter their council. May I never join their assembly. For in their anger they kill men, and on a whim they hamstrung oxen. Their anger is cursed, for it is strong, and their fury, for it is cruel. I will disperse them throughout Jacob and scatter them throughout Israel. I said, that doesn't sound like much of a blessing. Well, really, it's more of a curse. Now, you'll remember back earlier in the story in Genesis there was a guy named Shechem who raped Jacob's daughter Dinah. That was Simeon and Levi's sister. They responded by murdering the whole town that Shechem was from. And they didn't just get the guy who did their sister, they killed everyone. They killed all the men in that town. Jacob wasn't so happy with them for their violence, and he curses them here and says, you're going to be dispersed throughout Israel. What's interesting is this happens. Here I have the map, the next map. Simeon is this little spot down here in the middle of Judah. They had cities inside the tribe of Judah, but they were kind of dispersed and eventually got absorbed into Judah. And Levi, as you'll recall, are the ones who takes care, they're the tribe who takes care of the tabernacle and temple. They get no inheritance of land, but instead are scattered in cities throughout Israel. This is what Jacob said would happen. It's also interesting that Levi, you know why they get that job? Because when Moses came down from the mountain and Israel was in sin, he said, who's on the Lord's side? Levi comes to him. He says, all right, y'all take out your swords and go kill a bunch of people. They killed 3,000 people that day. Because of their drawing their sword, like their father Levi, they wind up being the ones in charge of the temple. So just an interesting little note. The apple does not fall far from the tree, right? If you want the reality. But God used it, and they were scattered throughout Israel. In fact, this is another interesting note on Levi, the 6 cities of refuge were under Levi's control. That's the tribe who controlled. You know what the cities of refuge were? That's where you went if you killed someone and they were hunting you. If you committed manslaughter, you went there. They were the ones who got to judge whether or not you were guilty. I find that interesting because Levi got scattered for killing people. I mean, it's just kind of an interesting dynamic that you just see this history repeating itself. You can check out some of that in Exodus 32 if you want. So that is what he says to his sons Simeon and Levi. It's kind of really from Jacob a curse. I don't know that they're really so cursed because God does work through them. And Levi actually is a pretty important tribe who God does do great things through in the priestly class and working in the temple. But it is interesting that they do get scattered. Next up is Judah, chapter 49, verse 8. Jacob says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches. He lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belong to him. He ties his donkey to a vine and the colt of his donkey to a choice vine. He washes his clothes in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth are whiter than milk. Of Jacob's sons, only Joseph gets more space in Jacob's blessing than Judah. Judah gets blessed. Okay, I mean, these other 3, they kind of got cursed, but Judah gets blessed. And Judah does actually end up with probably the largest territory and the longest lasting inheritance of the tribes. In fact, the very term Jew comes from the Babylonian pronunciation of Jude for the tribe of Judah. After all the other tribes have been carried off into exile, Judah is the one who's still there. And of the individual tribes, Judah probably gets the biggest piece of land, unless you count Manasseh and Ephraim together. In fact, I do have a map of that. Now you can see Judah's down here. They got all the land basically from the middle up there all the way down through, other than the pocket where Simeon is. What's astounding about Jacob's blessing of Judah is even though Joseph is clearly Jacob's favorite, he still correctly states which tribe would eventually have the kingly line. The scepter will not depart from Judah. The staff from between his feet. See, that scepter is the line of David, which eventually will come from the Messiah. Jacob is saying to Judah, he tells Judah, your father's sons will bow down to you. He's predicting, even here on his deathbed, that it's the tribe of Judah that's going to eventually have this kingly line. And it would be Judah that later becomes the southern kingdom, the royal line of David, the location of Jerusalem where the temple would be, the kingdom that would last all the way up to the Babylonian invasion. It's the tribe of Judah that lasts the longest. Furthermore, we're here celebrating Christmas, right? It's the son of David, the one whom obedience of the peoples belongs, that would come from the line of Judah. Jacob's foretelling this even here. The Messiah is coming through him. Now he continues on. Let's go to verse 13. He kind of goes through a couple of these quicker. They're more minor sons. Verse 13, Zebulun will live by the seashore and will be a harbor for ships, and his territory will be next to Sidon. Issachar is a strong donkey. I don't know if that was a compliment, calling your son a strong donkey, back in the day, but he's a strong donkey lying down between saddlebags. He saw that his resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he leaned his shoulder to bear a load and became a forced laborer. Now, these two tribes get a fairly small inheritance, surrounded by larger tribes, and because they're farther north, they are among the earlier tribes to go off into exile as they get conquered. Now, I do have a map here. I don't know if you can really see it, but Zebulun is that way and Issachar is this way, kind of up next to the Sea of Galilee. But I will tell you, the blessing really doesn't work out so well for Zebulun. There's a few maps who show their territory extending to the Sea of Galilee so that they make it to the seashore, but it really doesn't match what Jacob says. Zebulun isn't near Sidon, which is all the way up there. It would have worked better if they had gotten the land that Asher gets. Does that make sense? Maybe they should have swapped blessings or something to get it. But Zebulun's kind of more inland. And so if they get to the Sea of Galilee, then I guess they could have ships and stuff like Jacob says. But this actually brings up a good question on prophecy. The Bible accurately records Jacob's blessing. This is what Jacob said. The parts that come true, for the most part it does, but like what we see here with Zebulun, it just doesn't seem to match. Now, that doesn't bother me because the truth is if someone were making all this up, they would have made it match really well. The fact that it doesn't match kind of gives me some comfort that we have an accurate account of what Jacob actually said. But the question this brings up is how much of what Jacob is saying in this passage is prophecy, and how much of it is well-wishing of the Father wanting to bless his sons. How much is God revealed, and how much of it is a father knowing his sons? In most cases, Jacob hits on it with dead-on accuracy. Certainly he calls Judah. Certainly he calls, Manasseh and Ephraim. But here with Zebulun, it just doesn't seem to match. This doesn't really concern me greatly because Jacob never says, "Thus saith the Lord," this is what God has revealed. What he says is, this is what I think is going to come. He is giving them his blessing. And so he's making a statement. So is it prophecy or is it his opinion? Zebulun, however, does get some future blessings. One very famous town that we would know of and be thinking about at this time of the year probably landed within the borders of Zebulun, and that would be the town of Nazareth. And then we later hear about Zebulun and Naphtali being, of the Gentiles. They're the ones who get carried off into exile pretty early, and that area around the Sea of Galilee was considered Galilee of the Gentiles. But this would be one of the sons, Zebulun. All right, let's pick up in verse 16. Genesis chapter 49, verse 16. It says, Dan will judge his people. Jacob continues his blessing. Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the road, a viper beside the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backwards. I wait for your salvation, Lord. Dan's name actually meant judgment, so he kind of plays off the name. Jacob comments, and it's kind of really his comments here are a little vague, but it might pertain to Dan more as a person than as a tribe, although maybe it fits as a tribe. It is the tribe of Dan later that steals the idols. You get into the book of Judges, they steal the idols and steal the fake priest, and then they wipe out an unsuspecting village and take it over and name it the town of Dan. So maybe Jacob is speaking of their behavior. I do have a map of that. Dan, actually, the tribe of Dan is this section low down here next to Judah. They got a little oceanfront property down there, next to Judah. But they do later, they decide their property is not big enough, so they go all the way up to the top and they conquer a city and they name it Dan. And so Dan also gets a little territory up at the top. And so from then on, you'll always hear about all Israel did something from Dan to Beersheba. It's all the way from the top to the bottom, they all came. But that's because Dan added a territory up there to the middle territory that they got with Joshua. It's interesting to note that there is one famous but maybe a little bit scoundrelly Bible hero who comes from the tribe of Dan, and that is Samson. Samson was from the tribe of Dan. And that's why he's always fighting the Philistines. The Philistines were over here on the seacoast, and so Samson's having to deal with the Philistines who are in his territory. And Samson does judge his people. He's one of the judges in the book of Judges. I find it interesting, though, that Jacob, as he's going through this description of his sons, he states that he's waiting for God's salvation. I mean, he gets to Dan, he's like, Lord, I'm waiting for your salvation. Any ever look at your kids or grandkids and despair for the future? I mean, anybody been there? I mean, I think maybe Jacob is feeling this way at this point. Some of his sons, he's, Lord, I'm putting my hope in you because these guys are messed up. I kind of wonder if that's not what Jacob is doing here. Verse 19, he continues on, said, Gad will be attacked by raiders, but he will attack their heels. Asher's food will be rich, and he will produce royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. He blesses these three sons. He has sort of positive things to say about them, but he doesn't say much that's tangible to us to understand what, blessing will this be. Gad, kind of gets both blessing and curse. He's going to be attacked by raiders, but he's also, going to attack them back. And so there's kind of a mix there. Gad, by the way, is one of them that also does not make the promised land. It's one of the tribes who settles in the wilderness on the other side. Gad's over here on the other side of the Jordan. And so they were frequently attacked by raiders and dealt with, that. And so they stay there and don't make it into the promised land. They stay east of the Jordan River where there's good grazing land. Asher and Naphtali, however, both get land up here in the northernmost part. And it's good farmland. It's up there's a nice area. You get some good stuff up there. And what Jacob says about them sounds pretty favorable. So, they got good land, good blessing, good farming, good fishing. Might be interesting to note that with the exception of Zebulun, the tribes that were descended from the sons of concubines got smaller territories and were generally less noteworthy throughout Israel's history. It's the tribes who were descended from Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, who get most of the territory and actually play a bigger role in Israel's history. Now, as Americans, we tend to not think too much about the importance of family lineage as a part of what determines our future. But from a biblical point of view, your behavior can affect your family for generations, either for good or for bad. And this seems to be a part of God's plan for the family. Your ancestors, understand, your ancestors do affect who you are and where you are in life. Now, firstly, in terms of genetics, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. How many of you have ever realized how much like your parents or grandparents you really are? I'll never forget one day, I forget what my boys did. There was something my boys did, and this was my older boys when they were young. And I said something to them, and I had to stop for a moment because word for word what came out of my mouth was what my dad had said to me. Word for word, tone for tone. In fact, I paused and looked. Is my dad standing here? But we do. We actually do replicate our parents because we're genetically similar. It comes down to us. At the same time, we are also affected by the choices our family makes. We're affected. How many of your ancestors chose to come to America? See, now I don't think, unless you're Native American, your ancestors at some point came here from somewhere else, right? Most of us have a European heritage. I mean, I think I can say that. But your ancestors came here from somewhere else. Did their choice affect you? Did their choice to get on the Mayflower affect you today? Yes, I believe it did. And if you don't believe it, then why aren't you in Europe or wherever your ancestors came from? In fact, to be honest with you, everybody got off the boat in Noah's Ark. So even the Native Americans got here from somewhere. So, our ancestors spread out. Their choices affected us. The language you speak, you didn't invent the language you speak. You learned it from your parents. If you don't believe that your ancestors affect your life, then read the Bible, because you've got an ancestor in here named Adam and Eve, and their choices are still affecting you to this day. Furthermore, our choices will affect future generations. If you don't believe that, look at the national deficit. It will take my great-great-great-great-grandchildren to pay this off. Now, if you want a different future for your descendants, I'm going to suggest to you, try making better choices. Might make a better future. Now, Jacob saves the sons of Rachel. After he does the sons of Leah and the sons of his concubines, he saves the sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, for the last two blessings. And even though Jacob has already adopted Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own, he's already blessed them, he still blesses Joseph again in this blessing. And Joseph gets the longest, and if you count the two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, together, his descendants get the most land. Okay, so he gets the most blessing. This is Genesis 49, beginning in verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful vine beside a spring. Its branches climb over the wall. The archers attacked him, shot at him, and were hostile toward him. Yet his bow remained steady, and his strong arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the name of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, by the God of your father who helps you, by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of the heavens above, with blessings of the deep that lies below, and blessings of the breast and the womb. The blessings of your father excel the blessings of my ancestors and the bounty of ancient hills. May they rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince of his brothers. And so Jacob, in this blessing, considers Joseph to be the prince or the ruler of the family. And indeed, he is. I mean, Joseph's been Jacob's favorite son all along. And so now he's getting the double blessing, the blessing of his father. But this also fits with Joseph's dreams. Remember back when we started looking at Joseph's life, he had these dreams of his brothers bowing down to him. Well, Joseph is now that prince. He is in charge of Egypt. He's the most second powerful man in the world. And Jacob is just saying, may all the blessings that I have to give be placed on Joseph's head. Jacob's blessing was for the fullness of blessing of God, the blessing of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to land on Joseph and his descendants. And they were to be fruitful and prosperous. Not that he wasn't blessing the others, but Joseph held that special blessing. And I do have a map of this. There are two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, which make up the tribe of Joseph. Ephraim is the smaller portion down here, has this between Judah and Manasseh. Manasseh has the bigger section just above that, but then Manasseh also has this piece of land on the east of the Jordan because they were one of the tribes who decided to settle. So half of Manasseh settled in the wilderness, the other half went on into the promised land. So they actually are on both sides of the river. Jacob told Ephraim that he would be greater than Manasseh, But earlier in the promised land is when they come in, with Joshua and you get in the judges and all that part. Manasseh actually has more territory. But as the history of the nation unfolds, Jacob's words to his sons do come true. Because after King Solomon, as we get down further in history, Israel splits into two nations. They have a civil war, north and south. And Judah becomes the primary tribe of the south, the line of King David, and Ephraim becomes the primary tribe of the north and becomes the major power player there. Also, parts of Manasseh, particularly the parts on the other side of the Jordan, Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, Issachar, and Manasseh, those are the ones who get carried off into exile first. And so a good portion of Manasseh gets carried off while Ephraim is still in power. And so Ephraim does become the predominant tribe. Benjamin, even though it would have been one of Jacob's favorite sons, only gets one verse of blessing. This is what he says here, verse 27. Benjamin is a wolf. He tears his prey. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the plunder. Jacob's description of Benjamin, I think, basically says he's going to be powerful. I mean, he's a powerful creature. He doesn't really give us a lot of details of what he would see happening, but it does hold true. Benjamin actually, even though he gets one of the smallest inheritance, I do have a map of that. Benjamin's that little tiny one right there between Judah and Ephraim, a little bit over next to Dan. Benjamin has the smallest of all the inheritances. And even though that's true, throughout much of Israel's history, Benjamin is very powerful. Now, they are a small tribe because they almost get wiped out. If you read to the end of the book of Judges, Israel has a civil war where all the other tribes fight Benjamin because of some evil that they had done. And so they almost get wiped out. But Israel still, they rebound, and Israel's first king, King Saul, comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Later, Benjamin tends to side with Judah during the time of the divided kingdom. And so they stay in powerful situation. And actually, there's several different references in their wars where, they had these special, I don't know, it's like Benjamin they had their special ops team. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you want the Navy SEALs or the Rangers, that was in Benjamin. They were Benjamin and Judah. They just were good at the fighting. And so Jacob ends with this. Verse 28 says, "These are the tribes of Israel, 12 in all, and this is what their father said to them. He blessed them, and he blessed each one with a suitable blessing." And so before his death, Jacob blessed his sons. He gave them insight into what he saw in their lives, what he thought was coming. He did this, and he knew God had a plan for his family. He knew God's promises that, he's going to take him into the land. And so he feels he can share with his sons what is to come. Now, maybe you've been there where you can see into the lives of your children and grandchildren and kind of see where things are going. I mean, you've been around the block a couple of times, right? I mean, as we age, we start realizing in life the way things go. And sometimes, the youngsters in our family, they don't see it the way we see it. They don't see how their choices are going to have consequences until they come to you to help pay for it. Okay? And even then, if you pay for it, they're still not seeing how it has consequences. Okay? Think about that. But sometimes because you've had more life experience, and hopefully because you're walking with Christ and have developed godly wisdom, you can see into their life and see where things are going. And I think we would be wise to take a cue from Jacob and speak into their lives and encourage that which is good. Guys, do you speak blessings to your family? Do you encourage that which is good? There may even be times where you need to discourage that which is bad. Guys, this is not the right path. Guys, if you follow this path, this is where it's going to get you. It's going to cause you trouble. See, we have a special place in the life of our family. And not only do we have a right, but sometimes we have a duty to speak into their life with godly wisdom. Will they listen? I don't know. That's the choice they have to make. Did Jacob's sons always listen to him? Doesn't look like it. But he sure wasn't shy about telling them. He told them what he saw it. What I do know is this, that God does have a plan for your family. Because God has a plan for every person. If you have members in your family, I can guarantee you God has a plan for them. God has a plan of good, that He wants to do good in their life. If they will love God, if they will walk according to His purpose, they can experience that good. You have the opportunity to help them on that path. I believe we should seek God's wisdom for how we can cooperate with His plan and shape our future generations so they will honor God by living out His plan. Do we do that? Do we work in our life to shape those future generations? Now, I'd encourage you, the Christmas season's rapidly approaching. Take the opportunity to use it to bless your family. Think through spiritually how you celebrate. Think through spiritually what gifts you give. You say, well, my grandkids want this. Well, maybe, but they want a book of Satan. Don't give it to them. Give them something that's right for them. Well, that's not what they want. Well, what do you want? You want them to have a good life with Christ, or do you want them to go in the world? You have an opportunity to speak to them. I know maybe you've already done your Christmas shopping. I saw a good Dave Ramsey quote this week. Said, if you finished your Christmas shopping, stop shopping. Your January self will thank you. There's probably truth to that. Truth to that, right? But I believe at Christmas is a great time. We have an opportunity to speak positive blessings in our family, to illustrate the joy we have in Christ, to illustrate that our celebration is about Jesus coming to save us. That's what we're here to celebrate. We're not a part of the world's celebration. And this is an opportunity for us to do that by pointing our family toward God's will for their lives. And God does have a plan.